You know that at least 1/3 of all the human beings in the world today call themselves followers of Karl Marx and live in countries which are Marxist? But less than 100 years ago, Karl Marx was almost unknown, a poor scholar living as a refugee in London and having to be supported along with his wife and children by the contributions of friends. What is the power of the thought of Karl Marx? Marxism has swept through the world and captured the minds and hearts of human beings as only the great religions, Christianity and Islam, have done in human history. Is Marxism then in some respects similar to a religion? No other philosopher or social scientist has ever had a worldwide, international, organized following. We find ourselves coming back to the question, what is the strange commanding power that lies within the thought of Karl Marx? How can the global appeal of Marxism be explained? We can begin to solve this mystery by examining the forces shaping Marx's life in his own time and many places. The closeness of Marx's tie to the philosopher Hegel is symbolized by the year 1818. It is the year in which Hegel was called to a prestigious professorship at the University of Berlin, and it is the year in which Hegel's most famous follower, Karl Marx, was born. At first glance, there is little in the early life of Karl Marx which would lead one to predict that he would develop a philosophy for the rising industrial working class, the proletariat. Marx was born in the beautiful old German city of Trier, in the valley of the Moselle River, surrounded by vineyards and rolling hills. Marx's own family was comfortably middle class, his father being the official lawyer for the High Court of Appeal in the city of Trier. Both of Karl's parents were descended from many generations of Jewish rabbis. But Heinrich Marx, Karl's father, was a French Enlightenment figure, a believer in the gospel of reason and science. When the city of Trier was re-annexed from France by the government of Prussia and anti-Jewish laws were instituted, Heinrich Marx was required to convert to Christianity in order to retain his official position. He was baptized as a Lutheran in 1817, the year before Karl was born. Karl and the other children were baptized as Lutherans in 1824, their mother the following year. Karl attended the local schools, and when he was 17, he traveled by boat down the Rhine River to the University of Bonn, where he registered as a law student. After a year of writing poetry and drinking and dueling at the University of Bonn, Marx transferred, under pressure from his father, to the more sober and studious environment of the University of Berlin. But before returning to school, Marx became engaged to his longtime love from Trier, the beautiful auburn-haired, green-eyed Jenny von Westphalen, whose father, the Baron Ludwig von Westphalen, had for many years had a special fondness for the vital, intelligent young Karl Marx, and had stimulated in him an interest in Homer and in Shakespeare, and also in the ideas of Saint-Simon, the French socialist. These were to be lasting interests of Marx for the rest of his life. When Karl Marx came to the University of Berlin in 1836, the great philosopher Hegel had been dead for 5 years, but his influence in the university and in all of Germany was at its very peak, its very highest. The followers of Hegel were now split into conservative and radical groups. During the entire time that Marx was a student at the University of Berlin, from 1836 to 1841, the radical intellectuals at the university and throughout Germany were depressed and miserable. King Frederick William III of Prussia ruled as a strict reactionary against the currents of freedom which had been set loose by the French Revolution. Both liberals and radicals had had great hopes for his son, Frederick William IV, but he soon turned out to be a more efficient and shrewder reactionary than his father had been. Prussia was now an authoritarian police state. Censorship of the press, censorship of public meetings, and a central commission for the suppression of dangerous thought throughout Germany made any movement for reform impossible. Marx soon immersed himself in the works of Hegel, forgot about studying the law, and became one of the leaders of the radical intellectual group called the Young Hegelians. How had the political conflict in Prussia turned into the bitter conflict between the two camps of the followers of Hegel? Hegel was the dominant intellectual voice in Germany, and the conflict about Hegel came from the deep ambiguity, the two-sidedness, the paradoxical, ironical double meanings of Hegel himself, which we have already seen. On the one hand, Hegel had enshrined the Christian Germanic state of Prussia as the highest point, the culmination of all of human history. But on the other hand, Hegel had presented a theory of dialectic as endlessly restless, negating whatever exists in order to bring about change and development toward greater rationality. The Young Hegelians took the radical side of this two-sidedness of Hegel. They argued that the Prussian state, which was in fact becoming daily more restrictive and authoritarian, was not immune to the negative critical power of dialectic and must itself be criticized and attacked. Another ambiguity within the legacy of Hegel was hotly argued by the right-wing and the left-wing Hegelians. On the one hand, Hegel had nothing but contempt for political liberalism and for its twin components of individualism and democracy. For Hegel, the state has absolute power and moral authority over the individual. But on the other hand, Hegel's philosophy of history flew the flag of freedom. It had claimed that the true meaning of human history is that it is the progress of finite spirit in the consciousness of its own freedom. The Young Hegelians took the radical side of this Hegelian two-sidedness, and they called for freedom against the Prussian state. A third instance of ambiguity within Hegel, his two-sidedness or double talk with regard to God. As we have seen, Hegel's metaphysics or theory of reality was a breathtaking vision of reality as absolute spirit or mind, of a God who was the absolute totality of rational truth, of all conceptual rationality. But on the other hand, Hegel acknowledged that God has no existence except in the human sphere. God exists only as he is revealed, manifested, externalized, and embodied in human consciousness, in finite minds, in social institutions, in the course of history. The Young Hegelians took the radical side of this ambiguity about God, and they worked their way finally to the conclusion of atheism, that a God who exists only as human consciousness does not exist at all. And still another double meaning had been left by Hegel, the famous statement that the real is the rational and the rational is the real. The conservative Hegelians and the radical Hegelians waged war over this formidable and tormenting statement. The conservative camp took the first half of Hegel's statement, the real is the rational, and they interpreted it to mean that whatever exists is necessary in the rational process of dialectic, which embodies the absolute. Therefore, to try to change what exists, to change the status quo, specifically to try to change or undermine the Prussian state, is to go against the rational process of dialectic and to go against God, who is embodied in the state and also in the king. But on the other side, the radical camp took its stand on the second half of the statement, the half that said the rational is the real. They protested violently, these radicals, that Hegel never meant to defend the status quo. He never meant to say that whatever exists, no matter how confused or unworthy, is rational. What Hegel meant, according to the Young Hegelians, was that only what is rational has a claim to be called real, and that the most important task of the philosopher is to criticize all social institutions so that they can become more rational and therefore more real. Criticism became the slogan of the Young Hegelians. We can now begin to see the powerful influence upon the thought of Marx which was exercised by the Young Hegelians, these radicalizers of the philosophy of Hegel. Against the sanctity of government and of the Prussian state, they called for continuing the process of dialectical negation in order to reach to a higher and better form of government than the Prussian state. Against political absolutism, they called for progress in freedom. Against a God who exists only in human life, they defended atheism, the denial of the existence of God. Against defending whatever exists as rational and divinely ordained, the young Hegelian shouted that what exists must be criticized so that it can be made rational, more rational, by violent revolution if necessary. All this was proclaimed by the young Hegelians on the basis of their reading of Hegel. Hegel's own viewpoint, as we have seen, was not radical or activistic like theirs. His viewpoint was conservative and quietistic, but the young Hegelians were motivated to find a radical message in Hegel, and they were correct in finding it. What they discovered was that Hegel, as we have seen, was the master of paradox, irony, and two-sidedness. There was indeed a conservative and also a radical side of Hegel. The young Hegelians took the side which gave them intellectual support. But these feisty young radicals were not satisfied with merely reinterpreting the philosophy of Hegel. They were vigorously pushing ahead on three main intellectual fronts. First, with the notion of criticism. Their slogan of criticism inspired them to write pamphlets and books offering sharp critical attacks on laws, political thought, philosophy, and religion. Marx, by now, had become an extremist among the young Hegelians at the University of Berlin, and he seized upon intellectual criticism as the crucial means by which to change the world. But Marx will soon change his mind on intellectual criticism as the most effective weapon with which to change the world. Instead of theoretical intellectual criticism, the ultimate weapon to change the world will be for Marx the industrial working class, the proletariat. A second front in the campaign of the young Hegelians was derived from their criticism of Hegel's two-sided concept of God. A God who exists only as human consciousness, only in the form of man, does not exist. Therefore, the young Hegelians were atheists. But they drew a far more interesting conclusion from their criticism of Hegel's concept of God. If all of the absolute's development of rationality is within the human sphere, is carried out by man, then man is the true God. It is the human being who is the true divinity. Man is God. This intoxicating and grandiose concept led to the third front of the Hegelians, the young Hegelians' campaign. Man's divinity, his godlike nature, has not yet been realized. What must be accomplished is a revolution, a worldwide revolution against the existing conditions of the world, so as to make the world one in which the human being can live as a god. The third front is the concept of a necessary coming world revolution, a huge world catastrophe by which the institutions of the world will be destroyed, so that they can be reconstructed according to the philosophy of Hegel when it is truly interpreted. These three fighting fronts of the campaign of the young Hegelians, the power of merciless criticism as a political weapon, the concept of the divinity of man in place of God, and the view of a necessary impending horrible world revolution, destroying so as to reconstruct a rational world order. These three themes Marx incorporated from his years with the young Hegelians at the University of Berlin. They remain permanent themes within his developing thought. Marx finished writing his doctoral dissertation in 1841, but before he left the university, a great intellectual bombshell burst upon the young Hegelians. It was the publication by Ludwig Feuerbach, who was himself one of the young Hegelians, of a work called The Essence of Christianity. In this work, Feuerbach condemns the philosophy of Hegel as a disguised attempt to restore Christianity. Whatever is of value in Hegel, says Feuerbach, is not what it says about the absolute, but what it reveals about the psychology of man, the human being. Let us, says Feuerbach, cut out the Hegelian double talk about God. Let us place as the basis of philosophy not God or the absolute, but man himself. Man as a species, real material man in a real material world. Marx took away two messages from Feuerbach's attack upon Hegel. One was Feuerbach's materialism, his metaphysical theory that reality is primarily material and not spiritual, as Hegel had claimed. Marx was himself inclined toward materialism in any case. Feuerbach reinforced Marx's own materialistic metaphysics, which now became a permanent element in Marx's thinking. But secondly, Marx took away from Feuerbach the message that the philosophy of Hegel is still true, that when Hegel is turned upside down, when it is seen that Hegel is revealing man's life in the material world rather than God's manifestations, Hegel is still the master. Marx will apply Hegel's dialectic and many of Hegel's concepts to the life of human beings in the concrete material world. After Marx was given a doctorate in philosophy by the University of Jena, Marx moved to the University of Bonn, where Bruno Bauer, a young Hegelian and a close friend, held a teaching post and had encouraged Marx to try for one too. But by 1842, the Prussian Minister of Education condemned the Young Hegelians as an illegal group, and Bauer was dismissed from the University of Bonn. Nor was there any future for Marx there nor. Marx moved on to the city of Cologne, where he became for a while editor of a liberal journal, the Rhineland Times. But Marx's powerful, uncompromising, fierce, radical contributions to the journal soon brought official censorship down upon the journal, and Marx was forced to resign. There is a description of Marx as he appeared while he was functioning as editor of the journal. Karl Marx from Trier was a powerful man of 24 years old, whose thick black hair sprung from his cheeks, nose, arms, and ears. He was domineering, impetuous, passionate, full of boundless self-confidence, but at the same time deeply earnest and learned, a restless dialectician who, with his restless Jewish penetration, pushed every proposition of young Hegelian doctrine to its final conclusion, and was already then, by his concentrated study of economics, preparing his conversion to communism. Marx is surely recognizable from this description, written by one of the wealthy liberal businessmen of Cologne who funded the journal. The businessman goes on to say with regret, under Marx's leadership, the newspaper soon began to speak very recklessly. In a short time, the journal was officially banned. In April of the following year, 1843, Marx was married to Jenny von Westphalen. In her own right, the beautiful patrician Jenny had become a legendary figure of courage, intelligence, fidelity, and suffering. They moved to Paris in November, where they lived from 1843 to 1845. Why Paris? By now it was clear to Marx that German censorship and reactionary politics would silence him. He could say or do nothing of political consequence in Germany. He had lost interest in his young Hegelian friends at the University of Berlin, and the movement itself had been banned. Specifically, he was drawn to Paris by the offer of a job, assisting Arnold Rüger, a friend, with the editing of a new journal in Paris, which was to be called the German-French Annals, and which hoped to print both German and French radical literature. Marx quickly accepted the job. In a letter to Rüger in the summer of 1843, in which he said, I am tired of this hypocrisy and stupidity. I am tired of having to bow and scrape and invent safe and harmless phrases. In Germany, there is nothing I can do. In Germany, one can only be false to oneself. But there was another reason for the choice of Paris as the next stage in Marx's years as a radical exile and refugee from hostile governments. Paris, of all the great capital cities of Europe, was at this time the most hospitable and the most tolerant of all shades of political opinion. Paris provided a rich and exciting intellectual atmosphere, especially for the refugees and exiles from repressive states and churches, from Germany, Russia, Italy, Poland, Hungary, all of whom were busily engaged in literary, artistic, and political activities on behalf of freedom for all humankind. At the same time, France was undergoing rapid and socially disruptive change as the Industrial Revolution advanced through the country. The mass production and the mass distribution of the Industrial Revolution was driving out small business and making factory hands of growing numbers of the French population. The government of France was weak and corrupt and controlled by the newly created wealthy industrialists and financiers. Discontented factory workers throughout the South were engaging in riots and strikes. In this intensely stimulating atmosphere, Marx met Friedrich Engels, who was to become his lifelong friend, colleague, and financial benefactor. He met also the Russian anarchist Michael Bakunin, later his enemy, and he spent much time with French socialist theorists, especially with the socialist anarchist Pierre Proudhon, who also became an enemy of Marx's in very short order. The 1840s in Paris, before 1848, the year of the revolutions across the face of Europe. This period was a period of rapid development of French radicalism. Marx himself had little use for most of the French radicals. Some of them he suspected of lusting to bring about a bloodbath. Some were maverick Catholic priests whom he distrusted, but most of them he considered to be utopians, by which Marx meant that they were concocting theories of improving society which could never be actualized. They remained and would always be pie in the sky. Marx's Paris years, from 1843 to 45, were the crucial years of his intellectual development, not so much because of the stimulation of Parisian intellectual life, but because during this period, Marx fixated upon two questions which he would spend the rest of his life trying to answer. The first question was, why had the French Revolution failed? Why is it that Europe was no closer to freedom now than it had been before the revolution took place? The Age of Enlightenment had been naive to think that the world could be changed by reason, by science and education. But the Jacobin part of the revolution were also proved false by attempting to change the world through the reign of terror. Nor was there value in Hegel's viewpoint that the French Revolution had failed because the time was not yet ripe for the dialectic to reach the stage of freedom, since Hegel had given no indication as to how to tell when the time is ripe for revolution. What can be now known so that a new revolutionary strike for freedom will not fail? The second question which Marx was determined to answer was, what is the significance of the new industrial revolution, the great revolution of technology in factories, mills, mines, and agriculture, which transformed the social, economic, and political life of the world, bringing with it great wealth to some and widespread poverty and alienation to others, as Hegel had already noted in his account of civil society. What is the future of the Industrial Revolution? Can the gross inequities which were now visible in France, and even more so in the sooty, unhealthy factory towns of England, can this continue without a revolution to correct this? What is to prevent such a revolution from failing, as the French Revolution had failed? To answer these questions, Marx read with a frenzy while in Paris, plowing through everything written of significance which bore upon these problems posed by the French and industrial revolutions. He taught himself French by reading the works of all the French socialists who were currently celebrities in Paris. He read French and German history in accordance with Hegel's historical approach to the understanding of all human problems. And in order to deal with the economic problems connected with the Industrial Revolution, he read all the major economic theories in the field, from those of the 17th century to his own time, and most carefully Adam Smith's great work, The Wealth of Nations. From all that he read, he made copious notes of long passages, some of which he incorporated into his own manuscripts. This was to become a lifelong practice for Marx, the omnivorous reading, the endless note-taking, the great outpouring of manuscripts, many of them unfinished. Here in Paris, Jenny's first baby was born, and while she and the baby returned to her family in Trier for 2 summer months, Marx produced the work which is now called the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts, or the 1844 manuscripts. In these manuscripts is contained Marx's economic interpretation of history, a key concept of Marxism which received its full treatment only in his last great work, Capital. Meanwhile, the French-German Annals, the radical journal which Marx and Ruge co-edited, was seized in Germany, and warrants were issued for the arrest of Marx and Ruge. The first issue of the journal was also its last. Soon afterwards, Marx became a contributor to another radical journal called Forward, and this led to Marx's being expelled from France. Marx was given 24 hours to leave Paris. Jenny sold their furniture and left the city a few days later. Next stop on the refugee trail, Brussels in Belgium. In the Brussels period, from 1845 to 1848, Marx began to organize an international revolutionary group, and he soon joined with English radicals in an organization called the Communist League. Marx became the leader of this rapidly growing revolutionary organization, and in 1847, the Communist League commissioned him to write a document which would state the aims of the organization. Marx completed the statement of principles for the Communist League, and it was published a month before the outbreak of the Paris Revolution of 1848. It was the now famous Manifesto of the Communist Party. Marx was soon expelled for this from Brussels, returned to revolutionary Paris, and moved on to Germany, where the Revolution of 1848 was just now breaking out. But with the failure of the German Revolution, Marx was deported once again from Germany. Jenny pawned the silver she had inherited from her aristocratic English grandmother, and with this money they left Germany for the last time. They tried to go back to France, but were forbidden to live in Paris, and so the Marxes moved to London. Marx was now 31, Jenny was 35. London was to be their home for the rest of their lives. They lived in poverty, misery, and ill health. 3 of their children died for lack of money to pay for medical care. Yet Marx continued to write and plan for the world revolution, which he did indeed bring about, but was fated never to see. What is the power of Marxism? Next time, we shall probe into the developed thought of Karl Marx. Why were Marx's writings, the economic and philosophic manuscripts, which he wrote in Paris in the summer of 1844, why were these writings kept hidden from the public view for almost 100 years? Why did Marx never acknowledge them, never publish them, never refer to them in his later writing? Before these manuscripts of the young Marx were discovered and made available, Marxism had been thought of primarily in terms of the work of the mature Marx, and as being a scientific system, or as scientific socialism, as Marx and Engels themselves called it, or as an economic and materialistic interpretation of history, which stood Hegel's idealistic interpretation of history on its head. Generations of Marx scholars accepted the view that for Marx the meaning of history is found in class struggle, in class conflict, and the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. As a scientific theory, Marxism was regarded as having no moral or religious or philosophical meaning, but simply as offering a scientific explanation of the economic laws governing historical change. But when the economic and philosophical manuscripts were discovered and became known by the middle of the 20th century, a new view of Marx emerged from the study of these manuscripts, a view of Marxism as a moral or even a religious system of thought, which has as its fundamental theme the moral regeneration, the moral rebirth of humanity through world revolution. This is taken to be the meaning of the newly discovered system of the young Marx, for whom the burning issue is human alienation and its overcoming by a world revolution. Are there then two Marxist systems? Are there two Marxist views of the significance of history? Is world history the process in which human self-alienation is finally overcome and human beings realize themselves through revolution and appropriate their true essence as creative, wise, and free? Or is the history of the world the scientific history of class conflict and its ending by the classless society of communism? Does world history have a humanistic goal of human self-fulfillment and rebirth, as the 1844 Paris manuscripts indicate, or does it have a scientifically explained economic goal, as the writings of the mature Marx proclaim? Or is it possible to find a reconciliation of the humanistic and the scientific viewpoints in the thought of Marx, and to show how they may come together in his own understanding of his system? To raise these questions is to penetrate into Marxism below the usual surface accounts which summarize the main arguments of the late Marx. Let us turn to the economic and philosophic manuscripts, the Paris manuscripts of 1844, as they are usually called. Here we see the developing importance of economics for Marx. Marx in Paris had been voraciously, hungrily reading Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and other major economic theorists in his attempt to understand the Industrial Revolution, its present disastrous impact on human life, and what its future course might be. The importance of economics in human history had already been established in Marx's thinking by Hegel, by Hegel's powerful analysis of civil society, in which Hegel had said that the economic relations of civil society constitute a battlefield where everybody's individual private interests meet everybody else's. To Hegel, civil society and its economic affairs is a war of all against all. It is the continuous conflict of egoistic desires. Hegel's picture of the competitive evils of civil society, with its accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few, and poverty and alienation for the masses, was now reinforced in Marx's mind by the descriptions which he read from the French socialists about the miserable lives of industrial workers. Marx himself began to develop his own thoughts on economic life in civil society in an essay which he entitled The Jewish Question. Marx here speaks of economic alienation, of human beings estranged or alienated from the world of commerce in which money is the god. The modern commercial world, says Marx, is a religion of money worship, and he identifies this as Judaism. The Jews, he points out, are no longer a religious or a racial group. They have been forced into money lending and into the competitiveness of economics by society. As a result, says Marx, in his own words, money is the jealous one God of Israel, beside which no other God may stand. Money dethrones all the gods of man and turns them into a commodity. Money is the universal, independently constituted value of all things. It has therefore deprived the whole world, both the world of man and of nature, of its own value. Money is the alienated essence of man's work and of his being. This alien being, this money, rules over him and he worships it. Christianity, Marx says, has now taken over this money worship, this alienation of man from himself in the worship of money. On the question, therefore, of emancipating the Jews from laws which discriminate against them, Marx argues that the only way to deal with the Jewish question is to recognize that it is also the Christian question, and to emancipate both Christians and Jews from the worship of money, and thus from their economic alienation. Both Christians and Jews, he says, live in economic alienation as men producing objects which assume the alien form of money and become an alien power over them. Marx seems to have been uncertain of how to proceed at this point. The concept which was dominant with him was that of economic alienation. In the manuscript of 1844, Marx's powerful concentration upon economics produced a great new insight which swept him back into the orbit of Hegel. In the manuscript entitled Criticism of the Hegelian Dialectic and Philosophy as a Whole, there appears the insight on Marx's part that Hegel's phenomenology of spirit was in its underlying meaning a philosophy of economic life and economic interpretation of history, where Hegel talks about the externalization of spirit, of the absolute, estranged from itself, alienating itself in human consciousness. He was really speaking in a confused way, not of spirit's self-externalization and self-alienation in human consciousness, but really of man externalizing himself in material objects, of man's self-alienation in the objects which he produces. The underlying hidden meaning of the Hegelian philosophy, Marx discovers, is economics. Hegel, turned upside down, provides a study of man's alienation from the products of his own labor in the money economy of capitalism. And did not Hegel, in the famous chapter on master and slave in the phenomenology of spirit, show that the slave's production of the object appears to him to be an external and alien object, but that the slave overcomes the externalization and alienation of the products of his labor, and he recognizes his own essence in the objects he has made, discovers his freedom in his objectification of himself. The slave reappropriates himself from what had been the externalized, alienated products of his labor. Moreover, now that Marx has the key to the real underlying meaning and truth of Hegelian philosophy, Marx takes Hegel's phenomenology of spirit as the model for his own construction of an account of the self-realization of economic man, of labor. The true meaning of history is that it is the developmental process in which man, generic man, laborer, producer, creator of material and non-material objects, achieves self-realization and repossesses his own essence from the objects he has produced. And Marx, however, criticizes Hegel for his idealism, which sees the essence of man as spirit and sees alienation only as the alienation of consciousness or of spirit. But mankind, says Marx, is a natural being, not merely spirit, and mankind develops in the course of world history. He has powers, this man, faculties, desires, creative abilities, which have their outcome in production. Man is a creative being. Mankind in its history, says Marx, has transformed the objects of the entire material world, and he has created the entire world of culture. The vast historical and natural accumulation of the material and cultural objects that mankind has produced are the externalizations, the embodiments of man's creative powers. Man actualizes himself in the world. In Marx's own powerful language, the whole so-called world history is nothing other than the production of man himself through human labor. It is Marx's view, which he will never give up, that the history of human beings is the developing process in which they have created the entire world of objects of nature and of human culture. And in this developing process, human beings will come to realize their own true nature. But the human species does not realize that it is the creator of the world of natural objects and of the totality of culture. For example, the whole of modern industry is man's product. Machines and factories are the externalizations of human hands, ears, eyes, brains. But what man sees when he looks at the objects he has produced are alien things in an alien, hostile world, standing out there over against him. This is so because man's productive activity is done in servitude to the god money, rather than in spontaneous self-activity and self-determination. Human alienation takes three main forms, according to Marx, in the 1844 Paris manuscripts. First, man is alienated from the product of his work. Second, from the act of producing. And third, from his own social nature. First, the worker in industrial capitalism is alienated from his product, which exists external to him, is utilized by strangers as their private property, and the more he produces of them, the less is his productivity valued. He becomes cheaper than the cheap commodities he produces, and his work and his wages for his work are just sufficient to what is necessary to keep him working. Secondly, the capitalist system alienates man from his productive activity. His activity is not determined by his personal benefit or by his own creativity, but is something which he is compelled to do in order to remain alive. As a result, says Marx, the worker only feels himself outside his work, and in his work he feels outside himself. His labor is forced labor. The more he works, the less human he becomes. He finally feels at home only in the animalian functions of eating, drinking, and sexuality. And thirdly, capitalist society alienates the worker from his fellow man. Unlike animals, says Marx, who produce food only for their own immediate needs, humans produce cultural products, such as art and science, for the whole human race. Humans produce as universal beings. But the capitalist system reduces man's productivity to animal labor, to a mere means to satisfy his immediate physical needs. But the worker, too, is in bondage to greed, is a slave before the master money, the money god of capitalism. Capitalists advise him to save his money and invest it. As Marx says in the Paris manuscripts, this is the advice they get. The less you eat, drink, and read books, the less you go to the theater, the dance hall, the public house, the less you think, love, theorize, sing, paint, the more you save, the greater becomes your treasure, which neither moths nor dust will devour, your capital. The less you are, the more you have. Hegel had identified human passion as the prime motivating force in the human world, but Marx identifies this force as the passion of greed for money in capitalist society. To Marx, greed has been the motivating force throughout all of human history, alienating man from himself and dehumanizing him. Man worships money as the all-powerful master. And now Marx moves on to the final and inevitable question. How can economic alienation be overcome? How can man reappropriate from the objects which he has created his own essence? And the more fundamental question, how can man's self be regained? The entire world is distorted by alienation. Alienation infiltrates and pervades every aspect of human life, says Marx. Politics, law, the family, morality, religion, and economics. Alienation is the most important single character of man's life in human history. Man, the producer, has created a world of infinite objects and has lost himself in the process. Unlike Hegel's man, finite spirit, who in the course of history is continually progressing in consciousness of his own freedom, Marx's man, natural man, the producer, progresses in consciousness, but not of freedom, but of slavery, suffering, and exploitation. The law of his life is of constantly increasing alienation, says Marx, a law of increasing misery. For Marx, the only way for man to overcome self-alienation, to change himself, to free himself from the money mania, is to carry out a world revolution, a worldwide violent action, which will seize the world of private property from the capitalists and appropriate all the material objects which humans have created throughout history. After a brief stage of raw communism has passed, there will come about the time of ultimate communism, which Marx also calls the humanization of mankind. Man will repossess the lost world of created objects and will regain his enslaved powers. Labor itself will be abolished, and in its place there will be free, joyous, spontaneous, productive activity. And the end of economic alienation will also mean the abolition of all the other human relationships in which man has lived a life of alienation in history. There will be an end to the state, to the family, to all law and morality. All of these institutions, in Marx's view, are forms of human slavery. Man will repossess, reappropriate, regain himself from alienation in these institutions, and he will live in unity with his fellow man and with nature in the communist world to come. These were the principal ideas of the hastily written, disjointed economic and philosophic manuscripts which Marx wrote in the summer of 1844. That summer, Jenny had returned home to Trier with her baby, where she had visited her mother and Marx's mother, both now widowed. Jenny had already begun a lifelong pattern of ill health, which was in part perhaps a response to the tensions, crises, and the grinding poverty of her life with Marx. Highly intelligent as Jenny was, she accepted but was troubled by the limited possibilities for self-development which were available to women in her day. But she served her husband faithfully and devotedly as his secretary, copying his manuscripts, handling his correspondence, and she, in fact, became knowledgeable in the sphere of radical philosophy and politics. A recent study of Jenny offers evidence that she is the actual author of several essays which had been credited to Marx. When Jenny returned to Paris in September of 1844, she discovered that Marx had established a friendship with Friedrich Engels, a friendship so stable and unwavering that it soon became a legend in its own time. Both Marx and Engels had much in common. They were almost the same age. Engels was 2 years younger. They came from upper-class homes. They both wrote poetry. They both became involved with the Young Hegelian brand of radicalism. And they both moved on from that to communism and radical politics. But their intellectual styles and their lifestyles were very different. Marx was the speculative, creative, synthesizing type of mind, while Engels was practical and empirical. Marx was a family man. Engels was a womanizer and never married. Engels was the son of a Protestant family of wealthy cotton mill owners in the German Rhineland, and his lifelong career was in his family's business, and his interests were primarily in economics. During a year of his military service in Berlin, Engels came to know the radical Young Hegelians at the University of Berlin. He soon became radicalized by them and wrote essays for radical journals such as Marx and Ruge's German-French Annals. And he also began to gather data for what was to be his, Engels's, finest work, the situation of the working class in England, which was a bitter indictment of the early stages of capitalism. Engels had spent a year in England working at the Manchester branch in England of his father's firm, and on his way back to Germany, he stopped off in Paris, where on August 28, 1844, in a famous Paris cafe, he met Marx and began a conversation which ran on for 10 days, during which they decided to collaborate on a radical pamphlet which turned to be a 300-page book called The Holy Family. Before this book was finished, Marx was expelled from Paris and moved to Brussels. Engels soon moved into the house next door, and Marx and Engels began to work in September 1845 upon a criticism of the Young Hegelians, which was to become their important work entitled The German Ideology. What is significant about the book The German Ideology of 1846 is the intellectual break between it and the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844. Here in the German Ideology, so soon after the 1844 manuscripts, there appears the first formulation of the so-called mature Marxism, in which the theory of self-alienated man, which had been the central theme of the 1844 manuscripts, is now shrugged off as a conception of the philosophers, and presumably as having no value. Missing from the German ideology are the idea of the self, the objectification of the human essence in objects produced, the working man's alienation from himself, world history as a loss of self, and ultimate self regained. In place of the self and the humanistic concern of the 1844 manuscripts with self-realization, mature Marxism in the German ideology speaks about societies, labor versus capital, proletariat versus bourgeoisie. It speaks about relations and forces of production. It speaks about an economic base and an ideological superstructure. These are all words from the familiar language of mature, conventional Marxism. They appear to represent the impersonal scientific vocabulary of the social sciences. Why did Marx make this fundamental shift from the humanistic focus upon the self to the impersonal scientific focus upon economic relationships? Are there two Marxisms, that of the 1844 manuscripts and that of the later scientific socialism of the German ideology, or can they be reconciled? First, in answer to the question, why this switch, several suggestions can be offered as to why Marx made the dramatic switch from understanding human life in terms of the alienation or conflict within the self to understanding it in terms of external, economic, class conflict. The taking of this step may have represented to Marx gaining the objectivity and the great prestige of social science for his theory. A second suggestion is the role of Engels. Engels had an impressive knowledge of the economics of industrial capitalism, and Engels had made the claim that once an economic system is operative, it is beyond human control. These may have influenced Marx toward economic explanation rather than philosophical explanation. And a third answer, the futility of the idealistic, philosophical, humanistic, Young Hegelian movement, and the failure of this philosophic movement either to interpret or to change the world may have led Marx to turn to a scientific perspective instead. Two other explanations are psychological in nature. First, the growing personal maturity of Marx may have permitted him now to identify with his father's Enlightenment ideals of science and scientific objectivity, and to obey at last his father's constant urging him that, Karl, give up your fanciful young Hegelian speculations and become more prosaic, come down to earth. And a final explanation. In Marx's reference to, in the German ideology, to settling accounts with Hegelian philosophy, Marx appears to be switching to economics in order to establish, at last, his own separation and independence from the domination over himself of Hegelian philosophy, specifically of Hegel's humanistic account of finite spirit in the phenomenology of spirit. These are possible explanations of Marx's shift. There remains the need to answer the second question. Are there then two Marxisms, that of the young and of the mature Marx? And if so, can they be reconciled? What we have found is that the scenario of world history presented by the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 is that of economic man's alienation from the products he has himself created, and that of regaining himself through a world revolution. This scenario is revised in the writings of the mature Marx. Beginning with the German ideology, there is a new scenario of world history as class struggle and its overcoming by the revolution of the proletarian class and the ultimate advent of a class-less society. The scientific scenario, for the most part, eliminates the idea of the self, alienation, the drama of the loss of self and self-regained. And the new scientific scenario uses instead the impersonal concepts of labor, capital, economic production. Nevertheless, the scientific scenario of world history will continue to be expressive of the themes of alienation, conflict, revolution that produces human deliverance and salvation. Marx will use the impersonal concepts of the scientific scenario in such a way that the themes of the alienated man scenario will still be expressed. There are not two Marxisms then, but only one, which evolves from the conflict within alienated man to the conflict of economic classes. And the secretiveness of Marx, Engels, and Soviet officialdom with regard to the 1844 manuscripts is clearly the result of their embarrassment concerning revealing the philosophical, non-scientific, humanistic, and subjective roots of Marxism. We turn next time to the powerful works of the mature Marx. In a speech Marx gave in London in 1856, he startled his audience with this story. In the Middle Ages, said Marx, there was in Germany a secret organization called the Secret Court. And Marx went on, if a red cross was seen marked on a house, people knew that its owner was doomed by the Secret Court. And then Marx said, all the houses of Europe are now marked with the mysterious red cross. History is the judge. Its executioner is the proletariat. This is Marx's vision of capitalist society, deserving and receiving capital punishment at the hands of the proletariat. This is Marx's vision of world history and its future, a history of such great injustice and inhumanity that it can culminate in only one way, by sentencing to death all of the capitalist world. Let us take a close look now at Marx's materialist conception of history, which is usually called his historical materialism. Historical materialism is the central theory of mature Marxism. It is stated, developed, or restated at some point in all the major works of mature Marxism: the German Ideology, the Communist Manifesto, the Preface to the Critique of Political Economy, and Capital. What does Marx mean by historical materialism? Marx believes that his own materialism is radically different from all previous types of materialism in his awareness that the world of material objects, the material world, is not a reality which is independent of human beings, but is actually a reality which is transformed by the labor of generations of human beings over the long stretches of history. Marx presents his own conception of historical materialism as a radically new way of understanding history. Marx's historical materialism explains the whole sweep of history by taking man's material production as the basis of history, and mental production, the human thought process, as its effect. And Marx insists that this real basis of history in material production, in the whole conception of history, has never before been understood. What does Marx mean by his new view that material production is the real basis of history and that human thought is only its effect? Exactly like Hegel before him, Marx is trying to find a key which will explain the characteristics of individual human societies and which will also explain the changes which have taken place in human societies in the course of history. Like Hegel, Marx is an organicist. For Marx, no less than for Hegel, every individual society is an interrelated organic totality in which no part can be understood in isolation. But whereas for the idealist philosopher Hegel, the explanation of the organic unity of a particular society lies in the spirit of the people, which embodies the spirit of the absolute. For the materialist theory of Marx, the explanation of the organic unity of a particular society lies in its economic structure, its economic foundation. The concept of the economic structure or economic foundation of society is crucial to Marx's view of society and history. Marx's fundamental point here is that human beings in their history are unlike animals in a very important way. Whereas animals satisfy their needs by taking from nature what nature provides, human beings work, labor upon nature, and transform nature into things for humans, into the food and clothing and shelter which will meet the basic needs of human beings. And as man satisfies his basic needs, he develops new needs, which he is also increasingly able to satisfy by his labor, by his productive activity, by his transforming of nature. Marx analyzes this process of man's material production in society as consisting in three components. Human production is based, first of all, on the existing conditions of production in the particular society. By the term conditions of production, Marx means such basic conditions affecting human production as the existing climate, the geography of the society's physical location, the supply of raw materials, the total population. The second component of production, Marx calls the forces of production, and by this term he means all of the skills, tools, instruments, and technology, as well as the labor supply which are available to the society. The third component Marx calls the relations of production, and by this he means the social relations according to which the society organizes its conditions and forces of production and distributes what is produced among the members of the society. These three components of production may easily be seen to constitute a Hegelian dialectical triad in which the conditions of production form the thesis, the forces of production form the antithesis, and the relations of production are the synthesis of the two. The totality of these three components of production in any particular society Marx calls the mode of production, and sometimes the economic foundation or the economic substructure of society. This is the famous Marxian concept of the economic base or economic foundation or economic substructure of society. But now, Marx adds what is to become the crucial concept of his analysis of the economic foundation of society, and this is his concept of the division of labor. By the concept of the division of labor, Marx does not mean merely what the economist Adam Smith had meant, that labor becomes specialized in order to perform efficiently the many different skills required in production. For Marx, the division of labor into specialized jobs has dehumanizing and evil results. It enslaves the worker to a limited and restricting sphere of activity from which there is no escape. The worker, as a result, is alienated from the totality of his human creative powers, which can never develop under the division of labor. Marx makes this point in a striking way in his own work, The German Ideology, and he says, "For as soon as labor is distributed, each man has a particular, exclusive sphere of activity, which is forced upon him, and from which he cannot escape. He is a hunter, a fisherman, a shepherd, or a critical critic, and must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood." The division of labor brings into being a state of affairs in which no one any longer develops his full human potential, and no one any longer controls the means of his own livelihood. Moreover, where there is a division of labor, the relations of production take the place of human relations. Individual humans no longer appear to one another as persons, but as units within the impersonal process of the relations of production in society. Furthermore, the division of labor alienates the individual worker from his fellow workers. It sets one against the other, since each is working for personal gain and not for a social or human benefit. Did Marx, in exile in Brussels over 100 years ago, manage to describe certain aspects of your own life today? By the division of labor, Marx also means the division which occurs in the productive process between non-producing owners of the materials and means of production and non-owning producers. This division leads to a situation in which What one man produces, another man appropriates the greater part of as his own private property. Where there is a division between owners of the major means of production and the materials for production, and on the other side producers, the product of labor no longer belongs to the one who produced it, says Marx, but to the non-producer who owns the raw materials and the forces of production. Thus, on Marx's view, the division of labor is rooted in private property, and it leads to class division in society between the class that owns and controls the materials and means of production and the class of producers. For Marx, these two classes are in a master-slave relationship. The class of producers are in the position of slaves to those who own the raw materials and the factories and are therefore able to appropriate to themselves the major share of what the workers produce. Class struggle is the inevitable result of this relationship. Now Marx moves on from this account of the economic mode of production, the economic foundation, to his explanation of the cultural life of a society. His claim is that the economic foundation of society determines the entire realm of culture. In a famous passage in the preface to his book entitled The Critique of Political Economy, Marx says, "The economic structure of society is the real foundation on which rise legal and political superstructures. The mode of production in material life determines the general character of the social, political, and spiritual processes of life." Here we have Marx's most celebrated formulation of his view that human culture is not governed by ideas, by philosophic or religious beliefs, as it was for Hegel. It is governed, determined, conditioned by the economic mode of production, and all ideas, all thought in religion, philosophy, politics, ethics are entirely conditioned by the economic foundation of society. In Marx's famous words, "It is not the consciousness of man that determines their existence, but on the contrary, their social existence determines their consciousness." Morals, religion, law, political thought, philosophy, all are determined by the economic substructure of society, and they specifically reflect the class division within the substructure of society. The dominant morals, politics, religion, law, philosophy, and art of any society are the ideas of the dominant economic class. Here we have come upon one of Marx's most formidable contributions to the development of Western civilization. It is nothing less than the claim that all existing ideas in all the areas of human thought are distortions, falsifications of the truth. They reflect not reality as it actually is in the particular society, but rather as it appears from the viewpoint of the dominating and oppressive class within the economic mode of production. The characteristic thought and values of culture in any society are totally conditioned by the class struggle, and they represent not the thought and values of all classes in society, but only the thought and values which serve the interests of the master class, the exploiting class, which owns and controls the materials and the means of production. In Marx's words, the ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. This Marxian conception of all of human culture, religion, philosophy, law, political thought, morality, art, as falsifying and distorting the truth about social reality in the interest of a particular social class, this is Marx's famous and tremendously influential concept of ideology. Marx's concept of ideology may be defined as a system of ideas which are determined by class conflict and which reflect and promote the interests of the dominant class. All the claims to truth which philosophies, religions, political theories, moral systems have made in history are branded by Marx as ideologies. Throughout the historical ages in which there has been a division of labor and class conflict, the dominant beliefs within culture have served to protect the dominant class. Class conflict for economic control historically takes the form of a struggle to control men's thoughts so that they will believe and accept the authority of the ruling class. Marx exposes the history of human culture as a history of ideology, of powerfully effective religions and philosophies, which have presented themselves as universal and eternal truths for all mankind, while actually representing class interests. So, for example, the rising class of the bourgeoisie in the French Revolution called for freedom and equality, which appeared to be for the benefit of mankind, but in fact served primarily to give the bourgeoisie the political power which they lacked. So also Christianity is exposed by Marx as an ideology. It supports the ruling class by sanctifying its government as ruling by divine authority, and it keeps the poor from rebelling against society and the existing economic foundation by consoling them for their sorry lot on this earth by promising them rewards to come in heaven. All the principal ideas and values of history can be shown, according to Marx, to be rooted in class interests and to have functioned to keep the truth of the exploitative injustice and the dehumanizing aspects of civil society from being recognized by the exploited class. Marx's concept of ideology soon entered into the mainstream of 20th century thought and produced a new way of looking at any theory by asking the question, what class interests does this theory represent? How is it distorting, twisting, misrepresenting reality in order to defend, protect, promote the interests of some identifiable social group? As one contemporary philosopher has said, since Marx developed the concept of ideology, theory has never recovered from this ideological way of looking at it, this suspicion that all philosophizing, all theorizing is less pure, less universal, less detached, less true than it presents itself as being. The Marxian ideological way of looking at theory, at all elements of culture, has pervaded 20th century intellectual life. Today, all theory, all elements of culture are regarded as bound to the interests of some social group. For example, when you are solicited to subscribe to a magazine, do you not immediately think, what social class viewpoint does this magazine represent? Is there no escape from the ideological trap? Marx's reply is that there is only one way to escape the falsifying ideologies of the ruling class. In the coming inevitable worldwide revolution by the proletariat, the entire evil economic foundation of the world will be destroyed, and along with it, along with the foundation, the cultural superstructure will necessarily crumble and be destroyed, since it is only the product of the economic foundation. The totality of Western culture will then be destroyed. Philosophy, ethics, law, politics, and the proletariat will set about then ushering in a new post-historical era of truth. But to understand this coming of the inevitable historical Holocaust, we must turn now to Marx's theory of historical change. Marx's theory of history is constructed on the model which Hegel's great philosophy of history provided. History is a meaningful single developmental process. History is a rational structure which unfolds in time according to the laws of dialectic. But whereas for Hegel, the individual units of the dialectical historical process were the great nation-states, each embodying a stage in the progressing consciousness of freedom, by contrast, for Marx, the individual units of the dialectic of history are the powerful economic modes of production. Like Hegel, Marx's thinking exhibits historicism. He believes that one cannot understand economic modes of production abstractly, but only in terms of their historical situation and their own historical development. For Marx, only economic forces are powerful enough to bring about historical change. How does Marx's materialist dialectic of history explain historical change? Marx explains historical change by a conflict or contradiction which takes place within the triad of the economic foundation of society and shatters it. It is the conflict that develops between the constantly growing forces of production, the skills, technology, and inventions, and the existing relations of production and its distribution of the fruits or profits of production. Marx explains this explosive conflict between the constantly developing forces of production and the relations of production in this way. As man, the creative producer, works upon nature, he transforms production by developing new methods or instruments or technologies of production. In the early stages of a mode of production, the relations of production and the distribution of property aid in the development of these new and improved productive skills and technologies. But at a certain point in the later stages of a mode of production, the growing new forces of production come into conflict with the existing relations of production and their distribution of the profits, the results of production. The interests of the ruling class lead them, at this point, to resist change and to keep the existing property distribution unchanged, since their dominant position in society depends upon this. The ruling class, which had earlier helped to develop new technologies and forces of production, now fetters them and chains them down from developing further in order to protect their own profits. These relations of production must, according to Marx, therefore, be burst asunder by a revolution. But why does a social revolution follow upon this conflict between the forces and the relations of production? It is the producer class, labor, which suffers from the fettering, the chaining of the new forces of production. It is the producer class which stands to gain by the expansion and development of productive technologies and by a change in the existing income distribution. And so, acting as a class, the producers break the power of the dominant class by a revolution. Through the revolution, they become the new dominant class, seizing political power and generating their own mode of production, which will then determine their own ideology. This is Marx's analysis of the dialectical process of historical change. Let us look now to see how Marx applies this to the actual course of human history. Can he show that all of human history is decisively determined by the conflict, the contradiction between relations and forces of production, and that this leads inevitably to the violent destruction of the dominant social class by a rising social class and by a change in the mode of production? Marx boastfully claims that he has discovered the dialectical laws of history, which work with iron necessity toward inevitable results, just as the laws of natural science do. Does Marx provide a dialectical account of actual historical change which has iron necessity? In fact, Marx's interpretation of the actual historical process, which he presents briefly in the German Ideology, the Communist Manifesto, the preface to the Critique of Political Economy, and in Capital. His presentation is very sketchy prior to the breakdown of feudalism and the emergence of capitalism. The iron law of contradiction, which he claims to have found, between the relations and the expanding forces of production, he actually shows only in one case, the destruction of feudalism by the rising capitalist class. In his analysis of history, Marx postulated that there must have been a first stage of history in which the mode of production was a primitive type of communism, in which there was no division of labor, no separate spheres of owners and workers, no separation of mental production from physical labor, but only spontaneous work and communal ownership of all property. After this first primitive communist stage, all the succeeding stages of history are of modes of production which are based upon a division of labor, ownership of the major materials and instrumentalities of production by a ruling class conflict, and an ideological superstructure reflecting the interests of the ruling class. These modes of production, which have followed primitive communism, are the Asiatic, the ancient Greek and Roman, the European feudal, and the modern capitalist. The Asiatic mode of production is characterized by Marx only as one of oriental despotism and of the absence of private property in land. The classical Greek and Roman society develops a mode of production in which there is private property and in which the producing class consists of slaves. Marx's description of the European feudal mode of production is also only sketched in broad outlines. The feudal mode of production was based upon land ownership, with serfs chained to the land as the producing class. But then there began to develop under feudalism as well, in the towns, individual craftsmen who joined in guilds. The feudal nobility, who formed the dominant class, created a culture of philosophy, religion, art, and morality, which reflected their own class position and was determined by their own interests in the economic foundation. But the feudal economic base was destroyed. It was burst asunder. The new expanding forces of production demanded by the discovery of America, trade with the Far East and with colonies, and the new commercial and industrial developments burst through the feudal relations of production, which had become fetters upon the new developments. The rising new class of the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, then became revolutionary and transformed the mode of production into capitalism. They seized political power and they created, in time, their own ideological superstructure. But capitalism is doomed by the same conflict which enabled the rising capitalist class to overthrow feudalism. The constantly expanding forces of production, technology, skills, inventions, are now running into conflict with the capitalist relations of production and its system of private ownership of the materials and means of production and of profit from the production process. The rapid development of trade and technology, the growth of population, has brought about now, says Marx, an industrial revolution of machine production of goods and has created an international capitalist class. But the powerful, dominant international capitalist class has given rise to its own opposing class, the internationally linked class of the proletariat. Says Marx, what the bourgeoisie produces above all is its own grave diggers. The proletariat are the grave diggers for the bourgeoisie. The proletariat is now becoming conscious through their own economic suffering that the capitalist class is an obstacle to expanding forces of production, that the capitalists are fearful of overproduction, shrinkage of world markets, and of their own declining profits. At this point, Marx breaks decisively with Hegel. Hegel had only interpreted the past. For Hegel, wisdom about the past, about history, comes too late to change things. The owl of Minerva flies only when darkness is descending on a society. Not so for Marx the revolutionary. Now, he says, for the first time, we can understand the dialectic of history, future as well as past. The dialectical conflict between the relations of production and the constantly expanding forces of production provides a necessary iron law of history by which we can predict the future. The next development of history is inevitable. The proletariat will now become revolutionary. They will destroy the economic base of capitalism, just as the rising capitalist class once destroyed the economic foundation of feudalism. The proletariat will introduce a communist mode of production. They will seize political power, and they will erect a dictatorship of the proletariat, which will be an interim stage before the final coming of the class-less society. Can you not hear the thrilling, chilling call of the last words of the Communist Manifesto of 1848, heard around the world now for over 100 years? The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletariat has nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Workers of the world, unite. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. These opening words of the Communist Manifesto present the image of communism as a terrifying ghost, a mysterious apparition haunting Europe, and the manifesto ends with a threat that the ghost is about to come forth. The apparition is about to materialize. A communist revolution is about to break out, and it will overthrow by force the economic foundations, the governments, and the cultural existence of the capitalist countries of the world. Although both Marx and Engels are credited with writing the Communist Manifesto, in fact, Engels wrote only a first draft in the uninspired form of 25 questions and answers about communism. It is Marx who rewrites the whole document, and his rewrite is a work of genius, the product of his stupendous intellectual, imaginative, creative powers. The British philosopher Sir Isaiah Berlin has rightly said that no other modern political movement or cause can claim to have produced anything comparable with the manifesto in eloquence or power. The manifesto swiftly, deftly explains all the human past as the history of class struggles which have taken place according to necessary dialectical laws. Intertwined with this theoretical explanation of human history, the manifesto offers a diagnosis of the present period as a fateful time, the time of the last great struggle of history between the capitalist class and the proletariat, which is the last enslaved class remaining to be freed. But the capitalist class is the most revolutionary class which has ever existed up to the present time, says Marx. The capitalist system is so competitive that the bourgeoisie must constantly be trying to develop and improve their instruments and technologies of production. As a result, the achievements of the bourgeoisie have been tremendous. Marx acknowledges this in the manifesto when he says, "The bourgeoisie has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. The capitalist mode of production has revolutionized all the instruments and technologies of production, and it has brought technologically developed industry to every part of the world. During its rule of scarcely 100 years, the bourgeoisie has created, says Marx, more massive and more colossal productive forces than all the preceding generations of the world together. But along with its material achievements, the bourgeoisie, these leaders of whole industrial armies, have changed the face of human life by destroying the superstructure of the old traditional values and all human relationships. Nothing in human life has any value now except as monetary value in the capitalist economy. Capitalism has destroyed the feudal aristocratic culture. It has destroyed religious piety. It has turned the personal value of a human being into its worth as a mere commodity in the market. It has created enormous cities and subjected the country to the rule of the urban centers. And it has crowded laborers into the factories as slaves of the machine, receiving wages in exchange for work. It has destroyed the lower levels of the middle class, the small businessman, the shopkeeper, the farmer. All of these, says Marx, sink gradually into the proletariat because they lack the capital and the technology to compete with big capital. The enormous progress of the capitalist forces of production have vastly improved the material conditions of human life. But on the negative side, the revolutionary energies of the bourgeoisie in developing production will lead to their own destruction. In the manifesto, Marx says that capitalism is like the magician who is unable to control all the forces he has magically unleashed. So in the same way, the bourgeoisie cannot control all the new instruments, methods, technologies that they have created, and the result is overproduction of goods and the conflict between the capitalist relations of production and distribution of profit, and the constantly expanding forces of production and the constant flow of products. But the dialectical process is now moving rapidly. The contradiction between the expanding forces of production and the capitalist relations of production is worsening. Unemployment and starvation is what the proletariat suffers when the capitalist slows down production. No power on earth can prevent the outcome of this last class struggle. The capitalist class is doomed to extinction. It has performed its necessary role in the long history of man's transformation of nature and human nature. Now the proletariat class is destined by the inexorable dialectic of history to be liberated, and with this liberation of the last remaining slave class of history, all mankind will be free. The future belongs to the proletariat. It is theirs because the dialectical laws of history make it inevitable. Marx calls to the proletariat to break their chains, to liberate themselves by uniting in a revolutionary action under the control of the Communist Party, which will win for them the world which capitalism has developed. But here, Marxist theory runs into serious difficulties and confusions which it has never been able to overcome. Is it not confused and illogical thinking on Marx's part to incite the proletariat to action, to bring about a revolution that is inevitable and necessary according to dialectical laws of economics? Why whip the proletariat into action to bring about a revolution which is necessarily inevitably coming, so inexorable in its approach that no force on earth can stop it? Why fight for the inevitable? A second and related problem will now immediately occur to you. Is Marx in the manifesto offering us truth or propaganda? Is Marx's economic theory of history an objectively true theory which correctly presents what has taken place in human societies and in historical change, or is it instead propaganda, the manipulation of thought for a political end? In this case, the manipulation of the passions of the frustrated, suffering proletariat to take revolutionary action and overthrow capitalism. If Marx is in fact offering not an objectively true theory of history, but propaganda which will galvanize the proletariat into revolutionary action, then we can explain Marx's strange inconsistency in urging the proletariat to fight for what is inevitably going to happen anyway, as the result of necessary economic laws. Could this be Marx's thinking? That if his theory convinces the proletariat that their successful revolution against the capitalists is inevitable, guaranteed by necessary economic laws, then they will believe that this is true and will act on this belief and so make it come true. Then if the proletariat fights for the revolution because they believe Marx's propaganda that a successful revolution is inevitable, by their action they will have made it inevitable. This is, in fact, Marx's own viewpoint, which he has let us in on over and over again, and most clearly in his 11 Theses on Feuerbach. Did he not say, in the second of his Theses on Feuerbach, the question whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but is a practical question. In practice, men must prove the truth. This is to say that a theory about society or history is true, not because it provides an objective and correct analysis, but rather the theory is true if it works. If it leads people to believe in it and act upon it, this will make the theory true. But what view of truth is this? It is a view of truth which is today called radical pragmatism. Radical pragmatism is the view that a statement is true if it works in bringing about some desired goal, if it works in practice. But Marx's theory of history thus loses its claim to objective truth and is revealed either as propaganda or as radical pragmatism, a theory which denies that there is objective truth and claims instead that any statement must be regarded as true if people believe it and if it works for them in practice. The obvious danger in radical pragmatism is that a false theory, a theory which is merely propagandistic or manipulative or based upon myths or illusions, may be useful, may work in getting people to believe it and to take action in achieving a desired political goal. Should we call such a theory true because it works? A third problem also shows itself at this point. What kind of thinking does the Communist Manifesto represent? Is the manifesto science, or is it philosophy? Clearly, it is not science. The use in the manifesto of the philosophical Hegelian laws of dialectic and the propagandistic appeal for revolutionary action both disqualify the manifesto from being considered to be a scientific statement. nor is it philosophy, as philosophy is usually understood. Since if we compare the manifesto with Hegel's philosophy of history, for example, we see a profound difference. The manifesto does not merely interpret or explain history, it intertwines its explanation of history as a necessary economic dialectic of modes of production with explicit, inspiring political ideas and values on behalf of the interests of the proletariat. But then has not Marx fallen into the trap of ideology, which he himself set, and which he himself used to condemn all past theories? Is not his own theory an ideology, a system of ideas determined by class conflict and reflecting the interest of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie? Is he not, like all ideologists, seeking to promote the interests of a specific social group? And if the manifesto is so clearly ideological, a system of ideas serving to bring about the interests of the proletariat and their victory over the capitalist class, then must we not be suspicious of all the rest of Marx's writings as well? It was Marx himself who taught us to be ideologically suspicious of all theory. Marx's brilliant and forceful Communist Manifesto was written in great haste for the Communist League of London, which published it as a propaganda tract in what appeared to be a swelling movement toward revolution at that moment. But although at the time of its publication, the manifesto was hardly noticed by anyone, Marx and Engels had correctly sensed the coming of revolution. Before the manifesto had rolled off the printing presses in February 1848, the revolutions of 1848 had begun. Within a few weeks, the King of France was overthrown, and the revolutions of 1848 began to explode in one country after another, in Switzerland, Italy, France, Germany, Hungary. But all of these wildly hopeful revolutionary outbursts, in which middle class and working class joined together, were defeated and in ruins before the year 1848 came to an end. Now came the long years of exile for Marx in London, where Marx was to live for over half his life, from 1849 to his death in 1883. The first years in London were the worst. Marx and Jenny and their children lived in 2 or 3 rooms in a poor, crowded, run-down section of London. The spirits of Jenny and Marx were broken by the deaths of 3 of their children in the years between 1850 and 1856. They lived at the edge of starvation, hounded by creditors for non-payment of bills. Repeatedly they were evicted for non-payment of rent. Here was the beginning of the chronic illnesses that Marx and Jenny suffered, a period which Jenny later described as years of real misery. In London in the 1850s, Marx found himself isolated, with few friends, and exiled from the stimulating atmosphere of the European continent. Marx's own personality, aggressive, domineering, contemptuous, isolated him still further. And England was in no revolutionary mood. Its own recent radical movement, Chartism, had just been defeated, and England was just now at the beginning stages of an economic upswing, an enormous growth in industry and trade, which took the ground from under all revolutionary movements. The 1850s in England, after the radicalism of the 1840s in England, have been compared to the 1970s in the United States, after the radicalism of the 1960s. A new, sober mood, anti-radical and conservative, swept England then as it has swept our country today. And the economic upswing that began in England in the 1850s continued until the end of the 19th century. It is one of the ironies and frustrations of the life of Marx the revolutionary that he lived the second half of his life in a time of increasing economic prosperity and the continuing improvement of the standard of living of the working class. More and more the unionized industrial workers of England saw themselves as gaining better wages and working conditions, and the radical propaganda lost its appeal. Yet Marx continued his ties with the Communist League and with the revolutionary remnant of other exiles like himself. His days were spent in the reading room of the British Museum, which is the great public library of London, where he did his endless reading and his writing at the same desk every day, from 9 in the morning until 7 at night when the museum closed, then home to a long night of further study and writing. Here in the reading room of the British Museum, all of Marx's subsequent works were written. and most notably what he regarded as his greatest work, Das Kapital, Capital, the first volume of which appeared in 1867 and which had been 15 years in the writing. Here in Capital is the most complete statement of mature Marxism, of the scientific scenario of world history, and specifically the scenario of the present historical moment as a class struggle. What major new elements does Capital add? In addition to contributing a clear overview of the entire capitalist mode of production, worked out in great economic detail, Capital provides the famous concepts of the labor theory of value, surplus value, the theory of exploitation, and the polarization of classes. These are all economic concepts of the economic scientific scenario of world history, and we will look at them very briefly. First of all, what is capitalism? Marx develops, but does not ever change, his fundamental view that a capitalistic mode of production is one in which a few human beings own the major forces or means of production as their private property, and they employ as workers those who have nothing to sell but their own labor power. The commodities that the workers produce, Marx argues, have a value equivalent to the amount of labor needed to produce them. Here Marx is borrowing from the British economists Adam Smith and David Ricardo their labor theory of value, their principle that the value of anything is determined by how much labor has been required to produce it. The labor theory of value has been strenuously objected to by recent economists who have pointed out, for example, that the value of commodities is determined by supply and demand rather than the amount of labor needed to produce them, and also that it is not the amount of labor that determines the value of a commodity, but the degree of skill that is required to produce it. Directly related to Marx's labor theory of value is his crucial concept of surplus value. This is the concept which explains both the profit of the capitalist and the exploitation of the worker. Marx defines surplus value as the difference between the worker's wages and the value of what he has produced. That difference, the difference between what the capitalist must pay the worker as wages and what the capitalist can sell the worker's product for, makes up the capitalist profit. And here we have the key argument in Marx's theory of exploitation. Capitalism is a system of exploitation in which the capitalist profits by paying the workers the going rate of wages rather than the full value of the goods the worker produces. But another factor enters this picture of the capitalist mode of production. Capitalists are in relentless competition with one another in selling their goods, and this involves them in competing with one another by investing their capital in new machinery in order to increase production. But this investment of capital in more and more costly new machinery eats into the profit that the capitalist makes from the surplus value that his workers produce for him. Moreover, all of the capitalist competitors have also introduced the new machinery and have increased their output of commodities as well, with the result that larger and larger amounts of commodities are now produced and thrown on the market, and profits decline, and a crisis of overproduction occurs, in which the capitalist tries to salvage his business by cutting wages or by reducing production. But cutting wages or cutting production mean poverty and unemployment for the workers, and as these intensify, they lead to revolution. Here we have once more come upon the contradiction between the forces and the relations of production, which leads to revolution. And lastly, Capital offers its theory of the polarization of society into two economic classes. Marx believes that the capitalist class will shrink in size as capitalist competition increases, and the more successful capitalists undersell other capitalists and buy them out or drive them out of business. But while the capitalist class is decreasing in size, the proletariat class is rapidly growing in numbers because whole classes are gradually sinking into the proletariat: shopkeepers, skilled craftsmen, farmers. And in this way, capitalism reduces society to two main classes, one growing richer as the other grows poorer. But as the proletariat class increases in size, under the impact of repeated crises, unemployment, poverty, and starvation, they will come to see their real situation as it is, and they will become revolutionary. And now we must ask, what follows the revolution? What is the shape of the communist world to come? The communist world of the future, Marx tells us, will come in two stages. First, there will be the stage which Marx called the dictatorship of the proletariat, in which the proletariat will establish a government with absolute dictatorial power in order to guarantee a successful transition from capitalism to communism. Although for Marx the state is an instrument of class oppression, the proletariat itself must become a ruling class, using the state, army, courts, police, all the means of oppression and coercion in order to destroy any remnant of capitalist power. Marx calls the dictatorship of the proletariat a period of crude, raw communism. In this period, private property will be seized and made into the property of all in a crude, vulgar satisfaction of the same money mania and greed as had existed in the abolished capitalist society. This will be a materialistic stage of communism, a stage still focused on material goods. Everyone will become an employee of the state with a strict equality of wages. The old envy and jealousy which the proletariat had for the bourgeoisie will still be visible in the insistence in the dictatorship of the proletariat that no one receive higher wages or possess more goods than anyone else. The dictatorship of the proletariat will reduce the standard of living for all to a common low level, Marx predicts, and will preach self-denial for the good of the revolution and the sharing of work and the equality of wages. Crude communism will have no use for culture and civilization, but will fall to the level of the very poor who have no use for culture because they have no knowledge of it. In this stage of communism, the society itself is an all-powerful capitalist for whom everyone works and by whom everyone is paid. But have you not already recognized that Marx's description of the dictatorship of the proletariat and its crude communism is a remarkably accurate picture of present-day Soviet Russia? Has Soviet communism since the Communist Revolution of 1917 been in the stage of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the dictatorship of the Communist Party, and of Lenin, Stalin, and their successors? About the second stage of communism, Marx was understandably reluctant to be drawn into specific detail. In the world to come, the evils and shortcomings of all the dialectical stages of history will be overcome. Mankind's alienation from the work of his own hands will be overcome, and he will relate to the whole world of material objects as the product of human labor, which he can value and enjoy without the need to possess them as his private property. Mankind will be liberated from being controlled by the economic circumstances of life. And rather than wages strictly for work performed, the principle of ultimate communism will be from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Mankind will be liberated from the division of labor and from competition with his fellow man, since in communist society, as Marx says, society regulates the general production, and thus it makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, to fish in the afternoon, raise cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, shepherd, or critic. But how will this life of free, spontaneous activity be possible in the advanced historical mass society of communism? Marx does not tell us. Marx cannot tell us because it is not possible. But the picture he is trying to give us is clear. It is of a future world to come, as the end and as the fulfillment of historical time, in which man will exist in harmony and peace with himself, with other human beings, and with nature, and in which his life will be free from arduous toil, free from want or care, and his days will be spent in joyous creative activity. Here in this vision of the communist world to come, Marx has once more returned to Hegel and to a Hegelian vision of history as a great triad, from thesis of original primitive communism to an antithesis in the long centuries of toil under economic systems of private property, the Asiatic, the classical, the feudal, and the capitalist, and finally to return in the synthesis to a new advanced industrial communism. But Marx is also expressing something deeper than Hegel. His vision is a profoundly Judeo-Christian one of man's fall from paradise and the long years of labor in exile, with the hope of the peace and joy of paradise to be regained in the new communist world to come. And his vision also powerfully reminds us of the revelations of John in the New Testament, where John speaks of a great destruction, after which there arises a new and totally redeemed man in a new and purified Jerusalem. Here Marx has moved beyond propaganda, beyond ideology, philosophy, or science. He has moved into a religious vision and prophecy of the liberation and moral purification of mankind. But however powerful are the religious and moral currents in Marxist thought, his specific predictions with regard to capitalism and communism we now recognize as seriously mistaken. Contrary to Marx's predictions, capitalism has not been destroyed. Marx vastly underestimated the powers of capitalism to reform itself. The unrestrained capitalism of Marx's time no longer exists. Capitalism has long since incorporated many of the demands of the Communist Manifesto. And with respect to communism, again contrary to Marx's prediction, communism has not arisen in highly developed capitalist countries out of the conflict between the relations and forces of production. Rather, communism has sprung up in feudal, underdeveloped countries like Russia and China. Nevertheless, the contribution of Marx to the intellectual world stands and must be recognized, for his concepts of the economic foundations of society, social classes, ideology, and the influence of social, economic, and historical conditions upon human life, Marx must be regarded as a founder of sociology and of economic and intellectual history. His thought has transformed both the intellectual world and the political world. Marx died in 1883. Over his grave, a great sculptured head of Karl Marx looks out over London and beyond to a world in which, in his name, Marxist communism has spread from Russia to her satellite countries, to China, to Indochina, to Africa, and now to Latin America. What is the power of Marxism? It is the power of an ideology which explains the history of the world as economic exploitation and shows the way to liberation by a great final destruction, after which all of mankind will be purified and restored to paradise. A specter is haunting Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. A specter is haunting the world.